How can you improve as a cyclist, and how can you measure it? FTP is a term many of us are familiar with. FTP, of course, being functional threshold power. But what about looking at your body overall, measuring your body composition, your metabolic health, and your overall potential? I'm here in Albuquerque at VO2 Health Solutions, a new performance medicine clinic run by my friend Dr. Tim Erwin. At VO2 Health Solutions, you can get a number of things measured, including
body composition via a DEXA scan, resting metabolic rate using indirect calorimetry, active metabolic testing utilizing indirect calorimetry as well, lactate performance testing using blood lactate sampling, and then generalized blood work analyzing various biomarkers.
I'm going to be a guinea pig today to see where I can improve and how, and Tim will explain the benefits behind each of these tests. Start with the blood work.
It was a fairly comprehensive draw, as you know, because they took probably
5 miles. Yeah.
Yeah. I know, it's like, you're going to keep going. So we looked at your complete blood count, your comprehensive metabolic profile, so things like your fasting blood glucose, to really get an overall assessment of what your baseline health is. And, thankfully, most of the time, nothing comes back, but every now and then something might pop up. So, we looked at your iron, we looked at your hormone panels. We even looked at something called IGF-1, which is secondary to the amount of growth hormone that your body produces. And in doing so, I was able to just kind of get a overall snapshot of where you are.
How am I looking, Doc? Am I going to make
looking pretty good. I mean, you're looking pretty good. There were just a couple of things that popped up. Cycling performance, heavily dependent on, hemoglobin, hematocrit. Those numbers dependent on what your iron levels are. Mm-hmm. So looked at your iron levels. Those look good. Your liver function looked great. Your A1C, which is basically a look in arrears at how your glucose control is, that looks good. Your thyroid panel looked great.
How about for me? Do you find anything in there that's gonna put me into the world tour and the Tour de France if I just make a couple adjustments?
I found a few things that'll keep you out of it.
Okay, let's hear those.
I mean, and depending, if you did do something to correct them, you certainly wouldn't be able to get in. And what I'm referring to there is
EPO, testosterone, HGH.
Your hormone panel.
Okay.
Before we get to that,
my low T, Doc.
Yes and no, but that's a whole conversation in and of itself. No, globally or broadly speaking, but yes, when you get into the nuance. Yeah. So when we look at your testosterone panel, there are a couple things we're looking at. So we're looking at your total testosterone, which is just your absolute level.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, you're middle of the road. Okay. But there's a catch.
Yes, what's the catch?
The catch is that you're high in the things you don't want to be high in, and you're low in the things you don't want to be low in.
Within testosterone.
Within that, yeah, okay. Looking at that panel. So testosterone in your blood, it's not all just kind of floating around. The majority of it is bound to something called sex hormone binding globulin. It's bound very tightly to that, such that it's not available for use. So that's one protein that it binds to. It binds to another protein called albumin, but it binds to that loosely, so it can freely dissociate. So you can actually utilize the testosterone that's bound to albumin because it can freely dissociate. So when we look at going back a little bit, when we look at your testosterone, we're looking at your total, and then we're looking at your free, which is the amount unbound to anything, so you can certainly use that. And then we're looking at what's called your bioavailable testosterone. That's your free, which is not bound to any protein, and that's in addition to the testosterone that's bound to albumin, which, if you remember, is the one that it can freely dissociate from. So your bioavailable, the amount you can use, is a combination of your free and the combination of the testosterone bound to albumin. So when we look at your bioavailable, the lower range the lower limit of normal is 110. You're at 103.
That's a tricky wicket because obviously you've followed pro cycling as I have. Testosterone is a helpful thing, but adding in extra from the outside can
it's frowned upon.
Yeah. Not that I was joking about being in the Tour de France, but just even like recreational riding.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's just cheating, right? So
Yeah.
what's your perspective on supplementation of that?
I mean, it's definitely a touchy subject, right?
Yeah.
Because on one hand, you have a clear deficiency.
Yeah.
Right? And let's say you were to get to the middle of that normal range, I mean, that's going to have a clinically significant impact. You're going to feel different, right? And it's sort of hard because, I'm not over here trying to be Dr. Ferrari. But, by that same token, I kind of have to, really give you an honest answer. And that is an honest answer, is that, like, it would have a clinically significant impact.
Yeah.
But then you're precluded from any sort of competitive sport, right? That is a signatory to WADA. And so that's, I think, probably a sort of a pickle people will find themselves in. It's like, well, what do I do? Do I want to kind of feel crappy, or do I want to be able to do a parking lot crit? I mean, I guess those two aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, there are probably tons of people who do both, or address the first one and still do the second one.
Yeah.
But that's really the only thing that jumped out. Now, the other thing, your hematocrit, for someone who lives at altitude, I'd say I'd expect it to be just a little bit higher. I mean, you're at 45, which is totally normal. But, as a male at altitude, I kind of expect maybe, 47, 48, something like that. But, your iron panel looks good, so we know it's not a question of that. And your B12 looks good. There's another type of anemia that can be secondary to a B12 deficiency. But that looks good too. So that's really your labs in a nutshell. Overall, it's a good picture. The only really thing would be that, hormone panel that we talked about. But, for obvious reasons, that's probably not something, that you can address right now.
Tim was a pro cyclist back in the day, and now he's what I call a doctor, and that the guy has, yes, a medical degree, but also a PhD in biomedical sciences. He's also been helping me out off and on the bike for the better part of 25 years, including giving me lactate testing in his garage back 25 years ago when we were in college. Fast forward to today, and the testing is considerably more advanced, but the spirit of helping everyday cyclists in their journey is still part of his core mission.
So the DEXA scan is gold standard body composition analysis. Most places when you go, you're going to hold on to these two things. You're going to stand on a pad.
Yeah, I've got a Garmin scale.
That, exactly.
Stand on it and it gives me weight, okay, and then a guesstimate at a percentage of
body fat,
water, muscle, like all these different things, and then BMI.
Right. Yeah, and so that's using something called bioelectrical impedance analysis. So it's just kind of zapping a tiny current from one to the other, because you're probably standing on two like metal silver plates or something.
Barefoot, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's essentially measuring the time it takes for that circuit to complete. And then if you're more water or more lean mass, it takes less time, right? Because water is going to conduct that current. As opposed to if you're more fat, it's going to take longer because fat's resistive to that. And so that's how it does it.
And then the types where you hold on with your hands is a step above that.
I mean, it's another contact point, right? But it's still the same principle.
So I guess that's just easier to do because people can just walk in and do it and not have to take their socks and shoes off.
Right, yeah.
And then the DEXA is next level.
Yeah, the DEXA is gold standard because it's using a low level of radiation. Now, very low, we're here at 5,000 feet in Albuquerque, so kind of the equivalent of being outside for 3 to 4 hours, or 1 day of background radiation at sea level. So really negligible, but it's going to give you your fat mass, your lean mass, your bone density, and then kind of most importantly, sort of depending on where you're coming from, is your visceral fat. So the amount of fat around your organs, that can be very harmful. It can secrete pro-inflammatory.
Is that the so-called skinny fat, where someone looks rather slender but has a lot of visceral fat?
Yeah.
So is
exactly.
So they could be. They
could be like skinny to the the naked eye.
Yes.
But metabolically be in not a great spot.
So what did DEXA have to say here?
So you're good from that perspective. Your visceral fat. So we want to see you less than 100 centimeters squared of visceral fat. And you're at 57.6, so 58. So you're you're solid. The other thing, now we started getting into like why someone who's an athlete what they would want to know. One of the main things is what's their body fat percentage.
Yeah.
And your body fat percentage is 17, so you're 17%
Yeah.
body fat. One of the other usages of DEXA is looking at people who are coming back from an injury.
Hello.
Exactly. And so, we can see, because not only does it give you your total lean mass, body fat, bone density, it breaks it down by appendage.
Okay.
And so that's something that we can track over the course of a recovery, right? Like, because, as soon as you lose mobility of an appendage, you start to atrophy within a week. And it can be really hard to get that back. I'm speaking from personal experience because I tore my ACL and I still don't have, it's
been like a year, right?
It's been a year, a year since surgery. And I still don't have all the muscle mass back in and it's my dominant side, it's my right leg. But so, kind of as we would expect, you have less lean mass in your right arm than your left arm. And then we start getting into other, more esoteric things like your appendicular lean mass index. You're good on that, by the way. So that's the lean mass overall. Now your lower body is kind of, doing some heavy lifting to make up for that right upper extremity. But we can track that because as that index goes down, we start to get concerned about sarcopenia or just loss of muscle mass. And that happens as we age.
Is bone density something you can track with this?
Yes, bone density is. So we were just talking about kind of the lean mass stuff, but yeah, your bone density is good. So
I can't blame that for smashing my arm to bits.
No, and I would have thought maybe it was a little low, but because you've broken a few things in your time. But you're good. You're at 1.2 grams per centimeter squared. We want to see above 1. And then we'll move into the metabolic tests. We have the resting and the active. So we'll start with the resting. Sort of a host of markers here. So we're looking at heart rate variability, your sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation. So parasympathetic is the rest and digest. Sympathetic is fight or flight. So we want it in just a everyday state. We want to have greater parasympathetic because that means you're in a less stressful environment. And yours is good. You're coming in at a 60% ratio, so you're good. Your ventilation efficiency is great. Your lung utilization, tidal volume, so basically how much air you're moving, that's good. And basically what it's letting us know is there's no underlying pulmonary issue, so no obstructive or restrictive air disease. Heart rate variability is good. Excellent metabolic rate. Pretty good fat burning efficiency and mitochondrial function, and then good metabolic flexibility, so ability to switch between fats and carbohydrates as an energy source. The really useful information is when we get down here to what's called your substrate utilization. And what that is when you're at rest, what percentage of fats versus carbohydrates are you using to generate your energy? And we want to see you preferentially utilize fats as opposed to carbohydrates. If you're preferentially using carbohydrates, then you're on the road to metabolic disease. You're coming in middle of the road, so you use 50-50. So there really, there's a little bit of work.
There's room for improvement.
Yeah, there's room for improvement.
Great.
I think 60-40, 70-30 fats to carbs. Ideal person would come in and be at 80-20, but that's someone super highly trained. But the other sort of where the rubber meets the road data you get from the study is your basal metabolic rate. So how many calories you burn if you were just to sit in bed and not do anything. And for you, that comes out to about 2,300 calories. On a day you do work out, you need almost 3,800 calories. So I think that's good because you have to be intentional to get that many calories in. It can be hard, especially if you're just eating 3 meals a day. And of course, if you don't take in adequate calories, then just over time, you're just going to kind of dig a hole, right? You're going to become more tired, especially if you're trying to maintain the same training load or training volume.
And all this is coming from the resting metabolic test. Yes?
That's,
this is not even the VO2 that we're talking about.
Right. This is all from the resting test. And the way you can do it, so indirect calorimetry, it's analyzing how much oxygen you take in versus how much carbon dioxide you produce. And, without going into the chemistry, That's what allows us to come up with these numbers, because we know for every molecule of carbohydrate metabolized, you need X amount of oxygen, you produce X amount of carbon dioxide, and ditto for fat. And then so we can figure out those ratios and then assign these numbers. So, but it is unique to you. It's not an estimation.
Yeah, and then my next question is like, how do I improve that?
So, how to improve
that fat to carb
ratio?
Yeah.
Really, it's zone 2 training, which is having a moment right now.
Yeah.
But it really is zone 2, because in that zone 2, you get maximal stimulation of that energy system, of the oxidative phosphorylation using fat as an energy source. And so, like just like anything else, if you train it, it gets better, right? You get the enzymes of oxidative phosphorylation upregulated, your mitochondria become more efficient, and then that number over time will creep, in the direction it needs to. So you're going to rely more on fat than carbs.
Which leads to the next question of how I know exactly what my perfect zone 2 is. I and many others have been using, FTP as a method of zone calculation. Right? Go out, do the 20-minute test, take 95% of that max average power, or average power over that 20 minutes,
right?
And there's your FTP, and then you different coaching systems use different, as you well know, been doing this for years.
Yeah.
Break down. Okay, here's what your zones are. So 2 questions. One, how accurate is that? And then 2, selfishly, like, what exactly is my zone 2 training? And I guess that probably leads into the VO2 testing.
Yeah, that's a nice segue into that active metabolic report.
Yeah.
So to get back to your question, your first question is, how accurate is it? I mean, it's not going to be as accurate as coming in and having testing done, because again, we're looking at exactly what your body's doing. I mean, when you're looking at FTP, you're looking at sort of the mechanical output of watts, right?
Yes.
And then going based on that. But you're not really getting an idea of what is going on internally, what the bioenergetics look like. So there could be a discrepancy there. Especially when you start basing your zone 2, zone 3 off of that number, because with that 20-minute test, and there are cycling coaches who have more experience, in that area than I do, but I think there is the potential to dig in and maybe not falsely elevate that number, but it may not be 100% reflective of what you could truly do over an hour, because it's a 20-minute test. And, let's say you're digging in that last 5 minutes, and, from a bioenergetic perspective, you're just going off the charts, but you're still maintaining that wattage. Yeah, you make 20 minutes, but you probably couldn't make 22, right? Yeah. Certainly not another hour. So that's where I think it's beneficial to actually have a look under the hood and see exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
All right. So first, we'll tell you what your VO2 max is.
Okay.
Because that's the number, and we can talk a little bit about VO2 max. Now that, just real briefly, what it means is it's the maximum amount of oxygen that you consume at a maximal effort, right? And that number, from a performance perspective, is associated with potential to some extent, right?
Sure.
I mean, you could have 2 people of equal VO2 maxes, but maybe the person with the lower one does better because they can ride a higher percentage of that VO2 max. So their effective ability is higher than the person with the absolute, or higher than the person with the absolute, higher absolute VO2 max.
It's not the be-all end-all, but it's a pretty darn good indicator.
It's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really good for talent identification, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to find the next,
Matthew Van Der Poel, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to want to, at least as a starting point, have a kid that has a VO2 max of 70 or above. And I'm just throwing that number out there. But from a longevity perspective, which is probably going to be more of the people that I see, it is
longevity. You're just talking about just longevity of life.
Not like
longevity of a athletic.
No, longevity of life. Like, do you make it to 75 or 80? And then more importantly, what does life look like at 75 or 80? Because we know that to live independently, to be able to do your ADLs, I mean, you need a oddly specific VO2 of around 18.
To be able to do your ADLs?
Activities of daily living.
Okay.
So you can dress yourself, you can get out of bed, you can go to the bathroom, you can climb upstairs. That number's around 18.
Okay.
But the issue is, as everything else in life, as we get older, it diminishes. And so that rate of decline is about 10% per decade. So you can think of it as like a retirement account. You know, when you're saving money for retirement, you want to put as much in on the front side so that when you start to draw on it, you're going to have enough to get through. With VO2 Max, it's very similar, right? You want to build that number as high as you can, because if you're losing 10% per decade and you start at 50 or 60, that's very different than starting at 30.
Yeah.
You start at 30, you can just do the math, and you're a 30-year-old at 30 or a 40-year-old at 30. You know, three decades down the road, you know, you're kind of getting in the danger zone.
So how's my 401k looking there, Doc?
It's pretty good. It is, drum roll please, 58.
And
No, that's good. I mean, like if we pull up a calendar, that's gonna, for, you know, your age cohort, that's excellent.
yeah.
And then here's another little nice thing we get from this is your biological age as opposed to your chronological age.
It's not the age, it's the miles, as I often joke.
Yeah, exactly.
It's some rough
So
miles.
you have fewer miles than you might think. You know, your chronological age is 48, your biological age is 37.
Nice.
Yeah, so you're in a good spot.
So Garmin, with its edge computers and probably with its running watches, does what I call a lot of educated guesstimates, and that it gives you, it purports to give you many of these numbers. Here's your VO2 max. Here, you know, I feel like that's probably a similar story to like the scale, for instance, of like getting a DEXA scan versus standing on a Garmin scale. Like it's, on one hand, it's they're using the same terminology, like your VO2 max is this, but my Garmin computer has never put a mask on to measure my oxygen intake nor my carbon dioxide exhalation.
Right. Yeah. So they're using an algorithm based on the input from your activity. And I mean, it's proprietary, so I don't know what goes into it.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it can be close, but you know, why be close when you can be accurate, I think. So I'd be interested to know like what it reports as your VO2 max compared to this. Yeah. I mean, you know, in some...
It's given me 60 or 62 a couple times, which is very flattering, but it's sort of like a power meter that's off. I'm like, oh, tell me I'm handsome. I know you're lying, but just tell me one more time.
Right. I mean, and the thing is, it can go in either direction because, I mean, I've had people come in and say the exact same thing. They're like, well, my Garmin said I was at... I want my money back. You know, my Garmin said I was at 70. What are you talking about? I'm at 57.
Yeah.
But conversely, I had someone come in and they said... yeah, you know, it reported it was 68. And then they came in, they tested, they were 76. And so I think some of it is also dependent on how you train, right? Because if you, or what it's recording. So if you don't go out and do those super, super hard efforts for it to measure that and pick it up, then it's going to report a lower VO2 max than accurate. But, you know, as you can attest to, the testing or the assessment here is truly maximal.
Yeah. I could have done a second more. Yeah.
But I think that's, again, getting into the benefit of actual testing versus, you know, having something based on an estimation.
Yeah, so I want to know how to improve my VO2 max, how much wiggle room there is, and then also like what my zones are, what my zone should be.
Okay. Your zone 2, from a heart rate perspective, 118 to 129 beats per minute. And the way it's calculating that is, as it's analyzing you, it sees where your maximal fat oxidation occurs, the intensity that occurs. And that's where you're utilizing the maximal amount of fat. So that's, for you, 118 beats per minute. And then it's looking at something called the crossover point. You're using predominantly fat and less carbohydrate. But as that intensity increases, the utilization of those two substrates approach each other and then at some point cross, meaning you start using more carbohydrates as the intensity increases and less fat. And the point at which that crosses, your crossover point, is where it assigns you exiting zone 2. Mm-hmm. So for you, according to the data, it was 129 beats per minute. Mm-hmm. So that's really your sweet spot for zone 2, 118 to 129 beats a minute.
And how does that correlate to a wattage zone?
So for you, that occurred between 240 and 280 watts. So 280 is going to be you're getting into zone 3.
Yeah, the heart rate thing, that makes sense to me. The wattage feels like it's almost a little bit high for what I would consider all day zone 2.
Yeah, that might be. I mean, it's basing it off of the test protocol.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's where you were on the test. Now you're right. Were you to try and go out and do 2 hours at 280? I mean, that might be a heavy lift.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've ridden with you. I know you can do 240 until.
Yeah, 240s. That feels.
Yeah, for me that's hurting. But for you, I mean, I think it lines up. So keep in mind that as you're transitioning into zone 3, I mean, you're starting to feel it, and you're accumulating those byproducts of carbohydrate metabolism. Now we get to go and sort of pressure test it, right? Or stress test it.
Yeah, yeah.
On the bike and see how you feel. I mean, were you to come back and say like, yeah, I did a zone 2 workout and I'm just totally demolished. It's like, I averaged 270 or 260. Then I was like, okay, well, maybe we'll adjust that a little bit because, the lab is the lab and the real world is the real world. But I think this is closer to certainly an accurate picture than just an estimate. Yeah. Or, you could go out and say like, man, I did zone 2 at 240 and it was great. Yeah. So we know, you're on track. You're on the, you're at the right intensity.
Yeah. Okay. Now I've got my zone 2 by heart rate and by wattage, and spending more time there will help theoretically move
move your VO2 max.
I was gonna say move the fat max up slightly.
Yeah, spending more time in the zone 2 will move your fat utilization. It should move that needle and thereby increase the amount of fat that you're using at rest versus carbohydrate. The thing with zone 2 training is you have to be pretty intentional and almost really, I mean, the best way to do it is on a trainer because it's totally controlled. It's a totally controlled environment, right? You don't have any hills, you don't have any stoplights, you don't have anybody in a half wheel, or conversely, a half wheel you.
To get half wheel, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're out on a group ride and you're like, okay, I'm going to do my zone 2. That's what is on the schedule for today. Yeah. And you start making these excursions into zone 3, right? You start accumulating these byproducts of glycolysis or carbohydrate metabolism. It takes you about 15 minutes to clear those and get back into zone 2. So if you want to go out, and it's kind of okay if you go out, you say, I'm going to do a zone 2 ride. I'd like to kind of get after it a little bit. If you say that to the very end, it's okay. But if you do it 30 minutes in, you're going to take 20 minutes to kind of get back to zone 2, right? So you have to be sort of stringent with it. And that's why I say, when you do it, it's probably best to do it either by yourself or on a trainer. But, psychologically, that can be taxing. Although now, I mean, trainers are great compared to, when I was riding. I mean, it was a mag trainer and you're staring at the wall.
Yeah, Graham Obrey style.
Yeah, exactly. Switching cassettes out. But, I mean, now Zwift, Netflix, it's like, why not ride the trainer? I mean, that's what I do when I do ride, but... So we were talking about improving your VO2 max, and there's the central adaptation, peripheral adaptation. That's a better, or there's central component, peripheral component, however you want to say it. Doing that zone 2 work will improve the peripheral component. And then, it's like, I think everyone who watches your podcast is going to be familiar with the concept of putting in a base and then building on that base. Yeah. So that zone 2 is really building a good base. And then you go through, once you do that, then you start adding your high intensity stuff, and that high intensity stuff, it's still going to work on the peripheral component, but it's going to really work on that central component, your what's called cardiac output. So heart rate times stroke volume. Stroke volume is how much blood the left ventricle ejects with each contraction times your heart rate, and then that's your cardiac output. So the more blood that you're delivering to the periphery, the more oxygen, which means the more you can uptake. And then so you deliver the oxygen to the place that it can be utilized for metabolism, and then you start getting into the machinery that does that, the mitochondria, and that's what you've worked on with the zone 2. So in a nutshell, zone 2 plus some high intensity. Not too much high intensity though. Because you can end up getting tired, and you don't get those adaptations that you're looking for.
How much can that VO2 be increased?
So
roughly,
I mean, the numbers you'll see in the literature, 10 to 20%. A lot of those come from studies that are, finite. So 6, 8, 10 week interventions and then having someone come back. But my guess is over years, you can improve more than that. I mean, so here's an example. And this gets into a different type of training modality, but using blood flow restriction as a training modality. There was a study where they took highly trained rowers, and I think their average VO2 max was north of 60, so high. And then they put them through this training intervention using blood flow restriction. And theoretically, in a highly trained athlete, there's not going to be that much room for improvement, right? They've already improved their 10 to 20%. But in this study, they saw an improvement of about 9%. So there's still room there. It's just a question of, what does it take to get that? But I think, as a rule of thumb, if someone's, coming off the sofa, they get a baseline, they can definitely expect to improve it 10 to 20%. And I think you can, probably improve yours as well.
What else do we learn from the testing today?
The other thing that I think that's helpful is the amount of carbohydrates, or basically the calories that you use at your various zones. So just for instance, zone 2, you're on average using 16 calories a minute. Zone 3, 19, zone 4, 22. It's handy to know from a fueling strategy perspective. So if you're going out and you're going to be doing some effort that is primarily in zone 2 for 3 hours, you can kind of do the math and say, all right, at this rate, I need X number of carbohydrates or X number of calories per hour, and then work on fueling to that.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. Appreciate you.
Yeah, it was fun, man. It was fun putting you through the paces.
Parts of it were fun for me, but all of it was educational. And
nice.
Hopefully that was educational and fun for you to watch. Let me know what questions you have. I will answer to the best of my ability and punt the harder ones to the doctor here. And however you measure up on whichever tests you are doing, I hope you can get out there and enjoy the ride.